Hi, this is Bai Macfarlane with Mary's Advocates, and we work to uphold marriage against no-fault divorce and support those who are unjustly abandoned. And today I'm going to be reviewing with my guest Sheryl Temaat a book that came out within the last year. It's Consensual Incapacity to Marry by Catherine Godfrey-Howell, and she talks about what's happening in tribunals, particularly in the United States. So what Sheryl and I are going to talk about is, well, I'll get into that in a second. Hey, Sheryl, do you just want to say what's your background in this and why are you here?
My background in this is that in the 90s, something happened in my good Catholic family, and I was shocked. And I thought, this can't happen because this isn't what Catholics do. So I went to the seminary in Denver. It was a St. Thomas seminary at the time. It's now St. John Vianney Seminary. And I researched what's happening in tribunals today. And the books that I found were by Father Lawrence G. Wren. He explains how to declare marriages null. And he's serious. And it's just outrageous. You know, like the mother cried at the wedding, or silly evidence like the husband became jealous of the baby because the wife gave the baby the attention she used to give him. You know, silly stuff, just way off the mark from what marriage is. And I started writing articles for Homiletic and Pastoral Review. And Father Kenneth Baker had my articles reviewed by a canon lawyer whom he trusted, and he published them. So that's how I got started.
Great. And I got started because Mary's Advocates' work is to reduce unilateral no-fault divorce. And what I found out, and we're going to explain a little bit, what do we see happening right now in the United States, and do we see a problem, and what is the problem, and how did we get here? What I saw happening in my work about no-fault divorce is divorce was kind of just accepted as something that happens sometimes, like, you know, maybe a car might have gone off the road and they wrecked part of my lawn, and that just happens sometimes and you get over it. And it was kind of understood that prior to the divorce, well, if your marriage is really having one party be so unhappy, maybe it's because it's not really a valid marriage anyway, so there's no point working on improving your marriage because you're just a victim of an invalid marriage. And then even stronger, after a divorce, I mean, I've had people tell me that they're in confession talking to a priest about something totally unrelated, and somehow their marital status comes up, that they're divorced, and the priest is encouraging the person to apply for your annulment because annulment is viewed as healing. Like, the reason to get your annulment, it's like a mega confession. You go through, you answer these questions, it's cathartic, and it's healing. So I also, like you, started doing research. I would go to my local seminary. I'm in the Cleveland diocese, and I was researching what is going on here. So, I mean, that's where we are from my perspective. But do you have a sense of how did we get here? What was going on to get like this?
Well, tragically, the tribunals require a civil divorce before they'll even take a petition for nullity. And they're doing exactly the opposite of what God said in Malachi. God hates divorce. You know, Jesus doesn't allow this. Jesus doesn't allow people to divorce and remarry. He called it adultery. They're undermining the Lord himself with their policies.
And when our parents were growing up, there wasn't this rampant divorce and annulment and second and third marriages amongst Catholics.
Right.
I was a kid I was born in the 60s, so the sexual revolution is happening out in the world, and a lot of those ideologies seeped into the church. So the idea that you have an obligation to work on your marriage, well, if you're really unhappy or if you find someone else that's more interesting, like, well, that idea, I guess, wasn't enforced or promulgated, God knows what. So now we're living the consequences of all these broken families, and it's not working out too well. You know, all these fatherless children or husbands being abandoned, and then the no-fault divorce court takes their kids from them and makes them pay for a wife who's living with her new boyfriend down the road, or kids being scandalized. Yeah. I'm going off on a tangent here. You know, I have a lot of passion against what's going on with no-fault divorce, and I think the annulment issue is part of it. So anything more to add before we get into it?
Oh, then the annulment issue is the motive that drives it all. I think it's far more important than people realize. These priests who say, why don't you look into an annulment, aren't looking beyond that. Then when they get the annulment, what does mom do? She might have already been doing it, bringing in men, strange men, into the house, her quote unquote boyfriends who aren't boys. They're, they should be off and they should be married and taking care of their families. And what dad bringing in women. I mean, it's just awful for children to have to live with. It's just really awful.
All right. Well, then let's get into it. This book was Kate Godfrey-Howell's doctoral dissertation, and it was slightly edited so that it can be in the form of a book. And it's got a foreword by Cardinal Raymond Burke. And for the listeners who don't know who he was, he grew up in Wisconsin, and he got his canon law degree, and he wrote his doctoral dissertation about psychological grounds for annulment. He's focused on schizophrenia, and that was right in the early 1980s. Pope John Paul II appointed him to be the defender of the marriage bond at the highest tribunal in the world, which is the Apostolic Signatura. Then after serving there, he became a bishop in a diocese in the United States, and then he moved to be the Archbishop of St. Louis. Then he went back to the Holy See, and he was in charge of the Signatura, which is the tribunal that would get appeals after they worked their way from the United States to the Roman Rota to the Signatura. So he has a lot of experience. And he wrote a foreword to this book. And Sheryl, you pointed out something to me.
On page 21 in Roman numerals, XXI, Cardinal Burke wrote the foreword, as you say. And on this page, he says, this book can be very helpful for canonists and others who know or at least sense that, quote, the received American jurisprudence, unquote, still deeply grained in the operation of too many tribunals is not correct. Yep. Okay, and what we're going to review in this book is what he's talking about. All the different ideas that are going on in the tribunals, the grounds that they're using to declare marriages null, and the silly evidence that they use to support the grounds. I mean, nobody has a valid marriage. If you listen to these grounds, if you read them and you understand what's going on, you don't have a valid marriage. No one does. And that's not right. Marriage has a low bar. I mean, everybody, most people marry and have a family. That's what our vocation is.
And I appreciate the way Cardinal Burke, he's so polite when he wants to make a criticism. Like, this book will be very helpful for canonists and others, so you and I are the others, who know or at least sense that the received American jurisprudence, and for people who don't know what that is, jurisprudence is like case law in the canon law universe. So the American case law that's going on in tribunals still deeply ingrained in the operation of too many tribunals. He just says it flat out. It's not correct. So, what our author does is she goes through and she lets us readers see firsthand what the canonists were writing about in the 60s, 70s, and 80s as this incorrect practice became popular.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's shocking. As I said, it's just...
well, let's go to you got 94 and 95 was one of the Sheryl and I had talked before we did this recording, and there were some parts of the book that really illustrate these problems of the American jurisprudence, and we're just going to tell you our response to what Kate is reporting. So
right.
Go ahead.
She's quoting canonists. She found these case laws at Notre Dame in places where I couldn't go. I don't know if you could. I mean, you live close. I don't know if you live closer, but I don't know how she in her footnotes, that's what she is quoting. So, for example, S. Kelleher, one of the canonists who worked on the new code of canon law, in which 1095, canon 1095.2 and .3 is the canon that's mostly used to declare marriages null. Most of the marriages that have been declared null since the 1970s have used lack of due discretion or failure to form a communion of life, incapacity to marry one person, but you can probably have the capacity to marry somebody else, and that's what it amounts to. So as Keller says, basically, these new procedures will actually allow what is essentially divorce. He admits it. This is basically divorce.
Yep. And in the footnote below, we're on page 95, footnote number 242. Kate, the author, quotes his writings that she got from these archives, and he's talking about, if the church permitted divorce, would Catholics be in a more realistically effective position to influence civil legislation to sustain individual rights and to foster the common good? If Catholics were permitted to divorce, would this foster the common good? And he says yes. And really, the difference between divorce and invalidity, divorce is permanent separation where you're free to marry somebody else. That's what divorce is. And he's not even apologetic about it. So that one was pretty telling.
Quite compelling. Okay.
You want to jump to the next one on 128?
Page, yes. Okay. These are the requirements essential to the communion of life under the new grounds. Okay, we have to listen carefully to these. Germain Lesage lists these essentials to marriage. You have to have a balance and maturity required for a truly human form of conduct.
Balance and maturity required for a truly human form of conduct.
Yes.
So how is your priest who's doing a premarital investigation supposed to find out if people have that?
You find out by what happens in the marriage after, a few years after. Do they get along? Do they have a nice, peaceful family life? Or do they argue? Are they unhappy with each other? That's how you find out. That's not how an annulment procedure ever has worked.
Yeah, as I have talked to people, sometimes they describe a worst case scenario where someone commits adultery, 12 years into the marriage, and they're like, I'm going to get an annulment because she committed adultery. It's like, that's not a grounds for annulment. And people think that if something grievous is going on 10, 12 years into the marriage, that's grounds for annulment. Well, if the priests are telling the people what the priests learn from this guy who our author's quoting, that explains why they would think that. It's like, oh, gee, my husband's really being just difficult right now, and I don't think he has balance and maturity required for a truly human form of conduct.
But marriage is either valid or not at the time consent is given at the wedding.
Yep.
It's cut and dry. It's done right then.
Yep.
You're either married or you're not. And what happens after the marriage has nothing to do with your consent at the time of marriage. But these people have totally torn that apart. The next essential for communion of life, according to Germain Lesage, is the relationship of interpersonal and heterosexual friendship. There are times.
So if my husband is out golfing a lot and I'm sad, or I get along with my girlfriends and I find my husband annoying at this stage in my life, ergo, we're not married according to this guy because we don't have a friendship, I guess.
Right, and it was probably you didn't have that capacity when you got married, but you didn't know it until some years passed, and he went out golfing, or one of Ren's clients worked out in the gym for 2 hours a day.
Yeah.
My husband is working out in the gym right now, so
And it's like
I dare anybody to use that for grounds for nullity.
Well, and the reader doesn't know the difference between sinful, selfish behavior X number of years into a marriage or invalidity. Because, everybody comes into marriage with your own baggage. That's okay. That's humanity. Right. That's marriage. That's normal. That's been going on since the beginning. But to now say that these are essential things that if you don't have, you're not married is troubling to us, obviously. What else does he say?
Okay, he says mental balance and the sense of responsibility required for the material welfare of the family. He also says that you have to have the aptitude to cooperate sufficiently for conjugal assistance. If your husband doesn't take his turn running the vacuum sweeper, you've got you may have grounds for nullity.
Maybe, because my interpretation of material welfare might be different than my husband's interpretation of material welfare, because I grew up with a rich dad who did everything around the house, and my husband grew up with a salesman who was gone a lot. Who cares?
Yeah, right. Yes, but this evidence is on the witness testimony and a case that I'm helping with right now. Do you have the psychic capacity to participate, each in his own way, in promoting the welfare of the children? Well, if you don't, the children lose the home. They just lose everything.
I'm a little confused. Can you give some background on what are you saying here?
Do you have the psychic capacity to participate, each in his own way, in promoting the welfare of the children?
And
I don't know what that means.
Is that from Kate's? The thing I'm confused about, Sheryl, is that from Kate's book, or are you talking about something else now that the listener might not know where you're coming from?
I'm reading that from Kate's book, from Jermaine Lesage and his list of requirements essential to the communion of life. You have to have these requirements, and the judge at the tribunal will decide whether or not you have them. They don't mean anything when you read them. They don't mean anything to me.
They're very subjective. They're 100% subjective.
100%. They always are. Yes, they're not objective. Like, were you involved in a marriage before you married this person? So that's not a valid marriage. You can't marry someone if you're already married. You can't marry if you're impotent.
Yep. And I also know Pope John Paul II wrote an instruction to the world's tribunals in 1987 talking about this ground, the consensual incapacity to marry, and he says it only applies to people who have serious psychopathologies. So whether or not I'm friends with my husband is totally irrelevant to whether he was suffering a serious psychopathology at the time of the consent. And I think I would have noticed, or whoever, somebody would have noticed.
Oh, of course, as far as taking care of the children, they're always going to be better off. I say they're always going to be better off with the two parents in the home, even though they don't participate the way Jermaine Lesage requires them to participate. You can't. You're better off with two parents who do it in their own way, whatever way that. We can't get it perfect.
Yep.
It's possible. It's not possible. We keep working at it. We concentrate on virtues, not on psychology, which is mainly what tribunalists are trying to do.
Yep, and she's exposing some of them. You want to jump to the next one on page 168? And what?
155 was our next page.
Very good. I missed it. Go for it.
Because the only right that is exchanged between spouses at the wedding is the right of the body, the right over the body for the generation of children. That's the only right that they exchange. But the new canonists don't like that. They've changed it to all of these other issues of conjugality, which they just don't want to go there.
Well, and the way this was done is, in the late 1950s, the Pope announces that he wants to reorganize the canon law, and we're going to have the Second Vatican Council. They knew that they were going to wait until the council was done before they actually published the reorganized canon law. Then, in the documents of Vatican II, they're writing about marriage. They're writing beautiful things about marriage. Some of them are like just generalities, they're principles, they're just sacramental things, they're truths about marriage, but they're not juridical. They're not canonical grounds for a marriage being valid or invalid. So what happened is the canonists took the canonist in the beginning of this section on marriage has a description of marriage. It's a nice description, that's fine. But then the language in the description of marriage in the beginning was from Vatican II. And then the canonists said, oh, this description of marriage is going to replace what we canonists have been using as our understanding of the essential properties of marriage from this point forward. I've read stuff, I'm going to be sarcastic about it, but it's as ridiculous as the church was wrong for 1900 years. now we modernists, we're so enlightened, we figured it out with our modern psychology. We now know that marriage is different than it used to be. Ergo, blah, 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 all these reasons for annulment. And then I see other things. I have on my bookshelf back there a Roman Rota judge, Cormac Burke, and he wrote a book about grounds for annulment and marriage. And he's kind of correcting these people. It's like, no, you can read back from the 300s, the 500s, the 700s. And he's just quoting, doctors of the church and theologians that are describing the relationship part of marriage. That's nothing new. And it's not grounds for annulment when you're not satisfied. So.
Right. And if you read what the saints did when they had difficult marriages, it's just so opposite. We endure. You just endure. Saint Rita of Cascia, Italy, her husband was violent, but she waited until he calmed down and then she gently corrected him. Saint Monica says too, that's the way to do it. Well, they both converted their husbands. They didn't throw them out and look for somebody else. That's not what we do. It just isn't what we do.
So I'm going back to page 155. Kate is describing them talking about, it's like, in the old days, they used to say that what you're exchanging in marriage was the right to the conjugal act to procreate.
Right.
And they're kind of describing it as something that we now know better. Am I catching it right? Is that the essence of what they're talking about?
That's the essence of what they're talking about. Exactly. Right.
How about?
It has to do with partnership and what Bai Macfarlane talked about. Marriage is a partnership of the whole of life. In fact, one person we know got the rota. The rota is not what the rota used to be. It's been infiltrated also. He has a declaration of nullity from the Roman rota because he excluded partnership. He was open to having children, being permanent and faithful. And the rota judges admit that. But they say what he didn't understand is that he needed to include partnership. There was no definition of partnership except whatever the judge might decide in your local tribunal. And this is the rota. And so, of course, he's appealing that to the signature. I mean, that's just ridiculous. One priest I know read that and he said, those rota judges are committing mortal sin by declaring marriage null for such a reason. We don't even know how do you know when you're including partnership when you marry? It's not anything.
And in my work about divorce, if a husband was excluding partnership, whatever that means, to the point where he is dangerous or he's really, really wicked, that might be a grounds for separation of spouses. But unless someone's committing adultery, you don't have a grounds for permanent separation. The goal for both parties should be to work and get your marriage strength stronger. And a woman whose husband is so difficult, if she's a good Catholic woman, she would want to do everything she can to get him the right kind of help. She wouldn't go to divorce court and then file for annulment and then have the church. See, the thing that breaks my heart is if all the priests know is what they're taught in their 1 or 2 semester courses in their grad school program in their local seminary. Who's teaching those priests? They're being taught by the tribunal personnel. If the tribunal personnel in your diocese is the ones that Cardinal Burke is talking about when he says they have this American jurisprudence that is not correct, then you've got all the priests being miseducated. And it's just got this yucky ripple effect. So I'm hoping that people pay attention to this and start thinking differently.
Well, there are people who are upset about it. Yeah. On page 194, we came across an example that is just, as I said, every time I open the book, I find something shocking. So down in the middle part of the first paragraph, it begins, the attraction to marriage as a natural good is not enough. A person must be able to, in his or her consent, exhibit a kind of personal excellence as well.
So I guess if you can't play on the major leagues, you can't get married. But that's a personal excellence as well. The attraction to marriage as a natural good is not enough. I mean, I remember marriage is something that's ingrained in our nature, and it was designed by God, and people who aren't suffering from grave psychopathologies want someone who's permanently faithful to them. They don't want to be replaced by a new mom or dad for their kids. They want to be permanently their own children's mom or dad with a husband or wife who's faithful to them and not out committing adultery. You don't need to teach somebody that. That's natural. So, but this
Right.
guy is saying the attraction to marriage as a natural good is not enough. A person must be able, in his or her consent, to exhibit a kind of personal excellence. Is there more on this page, or is that where we were going to go with it?
Experts are used to determine an individual's sense of himself or herself in a marriage and as a partner. So the experts are the psychologists. Well, in the diocese where I live, the psychologist wasn't even, he didn't even have the credits that he said he had. He was some psych that was deciding on people's marriages, and he had lied about his own credentials.
Yeah, and let me give a little background for the people who are unaware. The canon law tells the tribunal judges that if you've got a case that's involving consensual incapacity with psychological grounds, they can, if they think it's not ridiculously superfluous, they can employ an expert witness psychologist. And that expert witness psychologist has the right to read all the testimonies collected from the parties and the witnesses. The expert witness psychologist could also even interview the party who is allegedly suffering or had suffered from this psychological anomaly at the time of the wedding. And then the expert the expert's employed by the diocese. So where's the expert getting, and then the expert can say whether or not, yep, we think this person wasn't able to enter marriage validly. But then it's this vicious circle that goes around and around and around, because if the expert works in a tribunal where they believe the mistaken incorrect jurisprudence, then the expert's going to say stuff like he didn't exhibit a kind of personal excellence.
And Pope John Paul II emphasized over and over that these experts need to have a Christian anthropology. They need to think like Jesus. I don't know hardly anybody who thinks like Jesus anymore, because adulterers don't have a place in heaven. You divorce and remarry, you lose your spot in heaven.
Yeah, that reminds me, the marriage therapist. How many times have you heard people in our circles who believe in the strength of marriage? Someone went to a supposedly Catholic marriage therapist, and after one or two sessions, one of the spouses is just complaining, and then the therapist is like, well, it sounds like you guys should get a divorce.
Oh, yeah. Most therapists will say that. Sure. That's their fix. They're not looking, they're not listening to those children in the next room sobbing their hearts out because they just want mom and dad back together. They don't want some strange man in their house when they open their presents on Christmas morning. That guy doesn't care anything about them. All he's thinking about is his next romp in the sack with their mother.
And they don't want to be going back and forth between two houses, so they can't play on the Little League, because when they're at dad's house, they're 45 minutes or 2 hours away. And they don't want to deal with holidays and special events for the rest of their life, where it's really awkward, because it's like, well, there's dad with his new partner, and there's mom by herself, and where do we sit, and who sits where? Yeah, not good.
And it's sad every single day when dad doesn't come home for supper, or mom isn't there to fix it, put things on the table all nicely. I mean, every day is sad for them. Their lives are ruined. So who's happy in all of this? The one person who forced divorce and argued at the tribunal that the marriage isn't valid and can remarry in the church, that's not a marriage. Cardinal Burke says it's not correct.
The one thing that struck me when I was reading this, and I don't have the page marked, was Kate is talking about how there's this ideology amongst the canonists that if two people are seem to be experiencing this communion of partnership in a way that they're satisfied, and either one of them had previously been involved with someone else where they weren't experiencing the satisfaction, well, then the goal of the church tribunal is to make sure these two people can have their marriage blessed. And that's their goal. And this marriage with the people before, it's like whether or not it was valid, whether they knew what they were doing, whether it was wrong that someone left, or is all kind of put out of their minds. And like they say flat out, unapologetically, our goal is that we have to make sure these two people who are getting along swell can have their marriage regularized.
And 5 years down the road, they're back at the tribunal wanting another annulment. The judicial vicar in my diocese has told me that. He said he had one guy up there was trying to petition for his 5th declaration of nullity.
It's interesting you mention that, because some of the most outspoken proponents for annulment information are people who have had like 3 annulments and are in a 4th supposed marriage.
They're experts. They're experts. Good luck on Judgment Day, people.
So that was page 194.
Yes. And on page 195, we have some more high bars for marriage today of good luck in reaching them. The person must be able not only to know, but also to appreciate the practical implications of the concerns of marriage as contained in Canon 1095. And you have explained what Canon 1095 is about.
Sheryl, where are you?
I'm on the top of page 195.
The person must be able to not only to know, but also appreciate the practical implications of the concerns of marriage as contained in Canon 1055. That's the one, it's the beginning of the marriage section where they're quoting stuff from Gaudium et Spes in Vatican II.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. This is the part where we notice that, well, a little background, romantic love has never been a requirement for marriage. It just hasn't been. That married couple in Fiddler on the Roof met on the day of their marriage. Remember that? They have that song. They didn't even know each other until the day they married. Well, it's a marriage as long as they consented to it. Love has never been a requirement, romantic love. St. Paul says, husbands, love your wives. Of course, Christian love is I can't even say it's required. But this sentence says, though consent makes the marriage and not love, love is the object of this consent. So they're trying to even argue that if you're not in love anymore, you're not married. I mean, the canonists since Vatican II who are in charge of all of this, that's about the middle part of that paragraph.
Yeah, keep going. Because after he says, love is the object of consent, I as a reader, I'm wondering, where are you going with this, oh canon law expert person? And then he goes on, however, if the consent is seriously impaired or defective, the object is not to be attainable. Interpersonal communication can in no way be reduced to a mere sex. Rather, it presupposes a capacity for love and giving by which some intangible personal goods are communicated so that the good of the spouses can be established and the purpose of marriage be attained. This is so subjective, it's not fair.
It's not fair. And this is from Father Rand. He argues in another of his books that if love ever were a requirement for marriage, it would be like the love that's in this Woody Allen movie that he watched called Hannah and Her Sisters. Mia Farrow plays the role of Hannah, and she refuses to allow anybody to care for her. She's all busy caring for everybody else. It's really a disgusting movie. I was so upset when I saw that Father Wren recommended it as an example of love. But he himself argued that love is not a requirement for marriage, and he seems to go back and forth.
Yeah, the back and forthness is the part that's troubling. And it opens the door for everybody's marriage to be declared invalid. And it also opens the door for people to say, wait a minute, I kind of know in my heart that I don't want my spouse committing adultery, and we agree to that. I kind of know in my heart that we're open to children, and we agree to that. And I kind of know in my heart that we're open to children, and that's what we want to do here. And yeah, as a secondary issue, it's kind of obvious that we expect to mutually help in the upbringing of our children. And yeah, we know we're getting into a marriage where people bring baggage, so we're going to grow in virtue and we want to have less. They talk about the remedy for concupiscence. Concupiscence is a propensity to sin. So one of the secondary ends of marriage is that you actually grow in virtue. I mean, ask anyone who's been married in a half normal marriage for a period of time. You find that out. Taking care of children, even doing it in a halfway, you do become less selfish, and that's a good thing. So it's like people, everything I just described is kind of tangible and knowable, and it's not so vague. And what these people are saying is so vague that nobody's married.
Exactly. Actually, everybody is married. If you stood before a priest, an authorized priest, and you vowed permanence, you said the words, "I take you for better, for worse, until death parts." You're married. I mean, no. What God has joined together, no man can tear asunder, and certainly not these goofballs on the tribunals.
Was there more on page 194 that you wanted to talk about? Or are we ready to go to 224?
We can go to 224.
Okay.
There's no new discovery to back up the revolutionary importance of expression of oneself in this respect. So Howell does quote some people who are opposed to all of this, all of these new views of looking at marriage. Two of them are Grammett and Watt. Father Grammett also wrote for Homiletic and Pastoral Review. I remember his articles. I'd have to go to Denver and look them up in the archives. But he wrote that the good of the spouse is actually bound up in permanence, fidelity, and openness to children. I mean, what could be better for you than to know that your husband is going to be with you always, and he's going to be faithful and have children with you and help you raise them and be there as grandfather? What could be better? Nothing.
Right.
And Watt was a psychologist, and he also wrote for Homiletic and Pastoral Review. So they did not go along with these views of the modern canonists.
Though we didn't go into specific quotes, I recall that when she was describing some of the things that these American canonists were proposing and writing about in their presentations to each other in their meetings, there was pushback from the Holy See to these canonists, and they were doing what they were going to do, and there was pushback from the Holy See saying this isn't Catholic marriage, and they just kept doing what they were going to do anyway.
As they did with everything else in the church, the Mass, the sacraments, they turned the catechisms. That was one of the first things I objected to. They went to Benziger and Sadlier, and we had the Baltimore Catechism in the town where we lived. But there was a Cardinal Staffa, who objected. He wrote out very clearly what the church was doing. This was the church in Holland under the Dutch Catechism. They started out with these new views of annulment. You're not happy, you're not married, is what it boils down to. Essentially, that's what it is. Yeah, there were Cardinal Ottaviani. I'm sure that he was opposed to all of this. They just got shoved away.
Yeah, and obviously Pope John Paul II was. Otherwise, he wouldn't have given his instruction in 1988, talking about how you can't use these psychological grounds saying grave lack of discretion of judgment unless you're talking about a serious psychopathology that makes someone so mentally off, I mean, this is my words now, that they can't understand the essential things of marriage, which you've been talking about. Sexual fidelity, openness to children, permanence. It's not rocket science, and it's in our nature. So I think, that was the last section that you were going to talk about on page 224. Kind of to wrap up and close, my takeaway from all of this is that Cardinal Burke flat out says there are some number of people who have been given annulments from their local tribunals that are incorrect. So what are those people going to do about it? That's kind of between them and God. But from my perspective as Mary's advocates, we support people who would believe their marriages are valid. So one could be affirmed if they wanted to read the more technical stuff, knowing that you have a good ground to stand on if you're from one of these tribunals that gives annulments to so many people. And the Canon Law Society of America collects the statistics from tribunals who are willing to share them. And the society publishes just every year the number of annulment petitions a diocese tribunal accepted and how those petitions were ruled. Were they granting an annulment or were they denying it? And there is like a third of them that give annulments to maybe 97, 98, 99% of the petitioners, virtually everyone. So, if you live in one of those dioceses, you might have reason to suspect that they're of that mistaken jurisprudence.
Exactly. But there is something else people can do, Bai. If you received a declaration of nullity that is affirmative, meaning your marriage isn't valid, according to that tribunal, you can appeal that decree. You can appeal and appeal and come up with new evidence is what you have to do. And Bob Kendra, one of our associates, did that. He appealed until his wife died. And then he insisted that the tribunal tell him whether or not he was married, and they would tell him. But he had an article in Homiletic and Pastoral Review about that. So you appeal the decision over and over and over. And your spouse, you cannot remarry as long as your decision, as long as your case is still at the tribunal.
Yeah, and that's a discussion for another day because Pope Francis changed the rules for appeal. It used to be that, and let's just leave that as a discussion for another day. If somebody wants to know about the procedural stuff for appeal, from Mary's Advocates, I do provide straightforward procedural information because it's not too complex about what the grounds are. It's more just a matter of when your right for appeal is open and things like that.
That's right. But there are others who have said that these annulments are not valid. Father Clarence, Monsignor Clarence Hedinger had an article in Homiletic and Pastoral Review. It's on their site. The majority of these marriages are valid. Your declaration of nullity is not valid.
And then Bishop Morlino, God rest his soul, prayed that he help us. He was interviewed by Raymond Arroyo on EWTN's The World Over, probably around 2015 or 2016. And he said flat out, he was really casual about, it's been known that the American tribunals it was either corrupt for 50 years. I mean, totally unapologetic.
Yeah, he did. So it's not a secret that what they're doing is scandals. Okay, thank you.
All right. Well, thanks, Sheryl. I'm going to show a picture of the book. Is this working?
I hope we cleared up some things. Right, that's the book. And I hope we didn't confuse anybody.
Okay, thanks. And we'll publicize this on a blog.
Bye.